Good evening, friends, and welcome to Catnaps from Sleepytime Tales. Catnaps are a new episode format that I'm giving a try. These are short, quick stories released in between regular episodes for people who need something fresh to help them sleep in the course of the week. These episodes will be released exclusively on Patreon for all patrons of the $1 and up levels, and also for free on RadioPublic with advertising. If you are listening to me right now, you are not on either of those platforms, and you're listening to the first sample episode, which is the only one that's going to be released on any of the other platforms. So if you like it and want to hear more, sign up on Patreon for only $1 a month, or subscribe to Sleepytime Tales on RadioPublic. The Story of the Deluge, The Remarkable Discoveries of Mr. George Smith by Edward Page Mitchell. Interesting particulars respecting the translations of the Assyrian tablets in the British Museum, newly discovered facts about the flood and Noah, together with some light on the history of the senator from Maine and the settlement of Brooklyn. Boston, April 26th. Mr. Jacob Browns of London, one of the assistant curators of the British Museum, in a private letter to a distinguished Orientalist of the city, gives some interesting particulars regarding the progress which has been made in the arrangement and translation of the sculptured tablets and lettuceros cocktails, should have looked up how to pronounce that, brought from Assyria and Chaldea by Mr. George Smith. The results of the past 3 or 4 months are gratifying in the extreme. The work, which was begun 3/4 of a century ago by Grotefend, and pursued by archaeologists such as Rask, St. Martin, Kelprith, Oppert, and the indefatigable Rawlinson, each of whom was satisfied if he carried it forward a single step, has been pushed far and fast by Mr. George Smith and his scholarly associates. The Assyrio-Babylonian cuneiforms, the third and most complicated branch of the trilogy, may fairly be said to have found their Oedipus. The riddles of Akkad and Sumer are read at last. The epigraphs on tablets dug from the earth and rubbish of the Ninevite mounds are now translated by Mr. George Smith as readily as Professor Whitney translates Greek, or a fifth-term schoolboy the fable of a man and the viper. It is not many years since the learned Witter declared that these stenographic characters arranged so neatly upon the slabs of grey alabaster, or the carefully prepared surface of clay like specimen arrowheads in the museum of some ancient war department, were entirely without alphabetic significance, mere whimsical ornaments or perhaps the trail of worms. But their exegesis has been perfected. The mounds of Nimrod and Kuyunjik and Khorsabad and Nebi Yunus have yielded up their precious treasures and are now revealing page by page the early history of our globe. Mr. Smith and Mr. Rounds are both confirmed in the belief, first entertained by Westergaard, that the cuneiform character is closely akin to the Egyptian Demotic, and also that its alphabet, which contains over 400 signs, some syllable, some phonetic, and some ideographic, is of the most complicated and arbitrary nature. As already intimated, the inscriptions which Mr. Smith and his collaborators have deciphered are in the primitive or Babylonian character, which is so much more obscure than either of their successors, or either of its successors and modifications, the so-called Persian and Median Cunei. Sennacherib's Library. The slabs of the greatest interest and importance were those found buried in the famous Kuyunjunik mound, first opened in 1843 by Mr. M. Paul Emil Botter and subsequently explored by Layard himself. The inscriptions are mostly upon clay and seem to have constituted the walls of the great library of Assurbanipal in Sennacherib's palace. Sennacherib was probably a monarch of a nautical turn of mind, for a large portion of the inscriptions illustrate the history of the flood and the voyage of Noah, or Niab as his Assyrian counterpart, who also corresponds in some particulars with the Deucalion of the Grecian myths. Piece by piece and fragment by fragment, the Diluvian narrative has been worked out, until it stands complete, a distinct episode in the vast epic with which Mr. George Smith is engaged in reconstructing. Mr. Rounds may certainly be pardoned for the naturally enthusiastic terms in which he speaks of these labours. And well may he be proud. These men in the British Museum are successfully compiling, brick by brick, what they claim to be a complete encyclopedia of the sacred and profane history, beginning with the conception of matter and the birth of mind. Their extraordinary researchers have placed upon them upon a pedestal of authority, from which they now gravely pronounce their approval of the Holy Scriptures, and even to stoop to pat Moses on the head and to tell him that his inspired version was very nearly correct. So graphic is the account of the adventures of Niab, or Noah, as he may more conveniently be called. So clear is the synopsis of his method of navigation, so startling are the newly discovered facts regarding the Ark and its passengers, that I am tempted to avail myself of the kind permission of the Boston savant, who has the honour to be Mr. Rounds' esteemed correspondent, and to translate somewhat in detail, for the benefit of your readers, the extraordinary story of the flood, as told by the Assyrian cuneiforms, cryptograms for 4,000 years, until the genius of a smith unveiled the mystery of their meaning. Mr. Smith ascertains from these inscriptions that when Noah began to build his ark and prophesy a deluge, the prevailing opinion was that he was either a lunatic or a shrewd speculator who proposed by his glowing predictions and appearance of perfect sincerity to depreciate real estate so that he may buy through his brokers to any extent at prices merely nominal. Even after the lowlands were submerged and it was apparent that there was to be more than an unusually wet season, Noah's wicked neighbours were accustomed to gather for no other purpose than to deride the ungainly architecture of the ark and to question its sailing qualities. They were not wanting who asserted that the thing would roll over at the first puff of wind like a too heavily freighted tub, so people came from far and near to witness and laugh at the discomfiture of the aged patriarch. But there was no occasion for ridicule. The ark floated like a cork. Noah dropped his centreboard and stood at the helm, waving graceful adieus to his wicked contemporaries, while the good vessel caught a fresh southerly breeze and moved on like a thing of life. There is nothing whatever in the Assyrian account to confirm the tradition that Noah accelerated the motion of the ark by raising his own coattails. This would have been an unnecessary as well as undignified proceeding. The tall house on deck afforded sufficient resistance to the wind to drive the ark along at a very respectable rate of speed. After the first novelty of the situation had worn off, and there was no longer the satisfaction of kindly but firmly refusing applications for passage, and seeing the lately derisive people scrambling for higher land only to be eventually caught by and swallowed up in the roaring waters, the voyage was a vexatious and disagreeable one. The ark at the best was an unwieldy craft. She fell off from the wind frightfully and almost invariably missed stays. Every choppy sea hammered roughly upon her flat bottom, making all on board so seasick as to wish that they too had been wicked and sunk with the crowd. Inside the miserable shanty which served for a cabin, birds, beasts, and human beings were huddled promiscuously together. One of the Deluge tablets says, not without a touch of pathos, it was extremely uncomfortable to sleep with a Bengal tiger glaring at one from a corner, and a hedgehog nestled up close against one's bare legs. But it was positively dangerous when the elephant became restless or the polar bear took offence at some fancied slight. I will not anticipate Mr. Smith's detailed account of the cruise of the ark. He has gathered data for a complete chart of Noah's course through the many months of the voyage. The tortuous nature of the route pursued and the eccentricity of Noah's great circle sailing are proof that the venerable navigator, under the depressing influence of his surroundings, had frequent recourse to ardent spirits, an infirmity over which we, his descendants, should drop the veil of charity and silence. The most astounding discovery of all, however, is a batch of tablets giving an actual and literal transcript from Noah's logbook, the journal of the voyage, which Noah, as a prudent navigator, doubtless kept with considerable care, was probably bequeathed to Shem, eldest born and executive officer of the ark. Portions of the log, it may be, were handed down from generation to generation among the Semitic tribes, and Mr. Rounds does not hesitate to express his opinion that these tablets in the British Museum were copied directly from the original entries made in the ship's book by Noah or Shem. He sends to his Boston correspondent early proofs of some of the lithographic facsimiles which are to illustrate Mr. Smith's forthcoming book, An Exhaustive History of the Flood and the Noachic Voyage. They should bear in mind that the inscription reads from left to right and not like Arabic and numerous other Semitic languages from right to left. Such progress has been made in the interpretation of the Aramaic dialects that it is a comparatively easier matter for Mr. Rounds to put this into our vernacular, which he does as follows, supplying certain hiatuses to the inscription where the connection is obvious. Scour arc, latitude 44:15, longitude. Water falling rapidly, ate our last pterodactyl yesterday. Hannibal Hamlin down with scurvy, must put him ashore. Thursday 7th, bitter ale and mastodons all gone. Mrs. Japheth's had another pair of twins, all well. The importance of this scrap of Diluvian history can hardly be overestimated. It throws light on 3 or 4 points which have been little understood hitherto. Having viewed the subject in all its bearings, and having compared the extract here quoted with the numberless other passages which I have not time to give, Mr. Smith and Mr. Rounds arrive at the following important conclusions. 1. When this entry was made in the logbook by Noah or Shem, the ark was somewhere off the coast of Maine. The latitude warrants this inference. The longitude is unfortunately wanting. Parallel proof that Noah visited the shores of North America is to be found in the old ballad, founded on a rabbinical tradition where mention is made of Barnegat. The singular error which locates Ararat, just 3 miles south of Barnegat, is doubtless due to some confusion in Noah's logarithms, the natural result of his unfortunate personal habits. Number 2. Ate our last pterodactyl yesterday. Bitter ale and mastodons all gone. There we have a simple solution of a problem which has long puzzled science. The provisions stowed away in the ark did not provide sufficient for the unexpectedly protracted voyage. Hard-pressed for food, Noah and his family were obliged to fall back on the livestock. They devoured the larger and more esculent animals in the collection. The only living specimens of the ichthyosaurus, the dodo, the silurian, the plesiosaurus, the mastodon, were eaten up by the hungry excursionists. We can therefore explain the extinction of certain species which, as geology teaches us, existed in antediluvian times. Were this revelation the only result of Mr. Smith's researches, he would not have dug in vain. Mr. Rounds justly observes that the allusion to bitter ale affords strong presumptive evidence that this entry in the log was made by the hand of no other than Noah himself. And third, the allusion to the interesting increase of Japheth's family show that woman, noble woman who always rises to the occasion, was doing her utmost to repair the breaches made in the earth's population by the whelming waters. The phrase hibaga may possibly signify triplets, but Mr. Smith, with that conservatism and repugnance to sensation which ever characterized the true archaeologist, prefers to be on the safe side and call it twins. Thank you for joining me on this week's episode of Catnaps. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you're asleep, and if it worked well for you, we'll see you again next week.